As in the Bake Group. As in my grandfather's family, technically.
The name landed in the room like a dropped pin, small, and then impossible to ignore. Beck, Elle Scarlett repeated, setting down her pencil so carefully it didn't make a sound. As in the Beck Group. As in my grandfather's family, technically, the young woman across the fitting table said, with the flat, practiced ease of someone who had said the sentence many times and stopped expecting it to hurt. I'm Kira. I got your name from an old business card. I was told you don't take new clients, but I was hoping you'd make an exception. I'm getting married in 5 weeks. Elle had built her entire life around the discipline of not reacting. 15 years cutting silk for women who cried in fitting rooms had taught her to keep her face still while her hands did the honest work. But the surname went through her like a cold draft under a door, and for a moment she said nothing at all. I don't do rush orders, Elle said finally. Which was true, and also not the reason. I don't need it perfect. I need it made by someone who isn't afraid of my last name. Kira's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. You'd be surprised how often that's the problem. Elle's eyes went, without her permission, to the back room, to the corner behind the bolt shelves where a locked chest had sat untouched since her father's funeral 2 years ago, gathering the particular kind of dust that means do not open. Why my shop? Elle asked. Out of everyone in Seoul. Because your father made my grandfather's suit for a funeral I wasn't born for, Kira said simply. My mother kept the receipt. She said he was the only person from that family who was ever kind to her, and he wasn't even family. She paused. You're the only piece of my father's side I have any proof was decent. Elle's throat tightened around a name she hadn't said out loud in 2 years. Kept the box. Told no one. He asked me not to. I need to think about it, Elle said, which was the closest thing to the truth she could manage. Kira studied her for a long moment, the too careful stillness, the eyes that kept sliding toward the back room. You know something, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elle didn't answer. But her silence, for the first time in 2 years, felt less like discipline and more like a debt coming due. If you're already wondering what's inside that box, and what else father promised the Beck family 30 years ago, subscribe now. This story does not go where you think it's going. The chest had followed Elle from her father's workshop to hers without her ever choosing to move it, the way grief sometimes packs its own boxes. That night, after closing the shutters, Elle finally lifted it onto the cutting table. Rosewood, iron-cornered, sealed along the lid seam with a hardened blob of red wax stamped with a mark she didn't recognize, not the Beck Group's modern crest, but an older symbol, 3 interlocked circles, the kind small manufacturers used before conglomerates swallowed them. Her father's handwriting, faded, was taped beneath the lid where only someone determined to look would find it, not to be opened until someone asks the right question. You'll know it when you hear it. DM. Elle sat back on her heels, heart working harder than the moment should have justified. She had grown up hearing her father speak of Korea the way other men spoke of debts they were still paying, with a gratitude so heavy it looked, from the outside, almost like grief. A man saved this family once, he'd told her, only once, the year before he died. Not with money. With his name, when mine wasn't worth anything here. He had never said the man's name. He had never said what he owed in return. Now a granddaughter of that man had walked into her shop and asked, without knowing it, exactly the wrong question, or, Elle thought, running her thumb over the old wax seal, exactly the right one. She didn't open it. Not yet. She wasn't ready to know what her father had spent 30 years protecting her from. But she photographed the seal, zoomed in on her phone until the 3 circles filled the screen, and sat with it long after the shop had gone dark, the ghost of her father's careful, Taylor's handwriting looking back at her like a question she didn't yet know how to answer. 2 kilometers away, in an apartment Kira had never questioned too closely how she could afford on a junior designer's salary, an envelope arrived the way it always did, no return address, no note, just enough cash to cover the difference between what she earned and what her rent cost. It had happened every month for 6 years. Kira used to imagine it was her mother's doing, some hidden inheritance from a father who never once called. She'd stopped asking questions around year 3, the way you stop pressing a bruise once you've learned exactly how much it hurts. Across the city, in an office 3 floors below Baek Tae-min's, Han Ji-yeon sealed an identical envelope and did not sign it, the same way she hadn't signed one in 6 years. Her phone buzzed before she'd finished. Tae-min's name on the screen, which meant business, not family. "She's back in Seoul," he said without greeting. "Kira." My mother's assistant flagged a wire inquiry, Marsh and Hannah Atelier. The old tailor's daughter's shop. Ji-yeon's hand went very still around the envelope. "Marsh," she repeated. "You remember the name." "I remember the funeral suit," Ji-yeon said carefully. "Everyone who was in that house in '94 remembers the funeral suit." There was a long pause on the line, the specific silence of a man doing math he didn't want to do. "The vote's in 5 weeks, Tae-min said finally. "I need this quiet until then. Whatever it costs." "And after the vote?" "After the vote, it's not my mother's problem to manage anymore. It's mine." He hung up before she could answer. Ji-yeon looked down at the envelope in her hand, 6 years of silence, sealed and sent like an apology no one was allowed to read as one, and, for the first time, wondered whether the kindest thing she'd ever done for Kira Beck had also been the cruelest. Elle told herself the decision was professional. A wedding dress was a wedding dress, a name on an invoice didn't obligate her to anything. She almost believed it until Kira came back for the second fitting appointment carrying, unprompted, a photograph, Junho, young, laughing, an arm slung around a man Elle's father had once mentioned only as the one who vouched for us. "That's the only picture I have of him," Kira said. "My mother kept exactly one. I used to think that meant she didn't love him enough to keep more. Took me 20 years to realize it probably meant the opposite, that one was all she could survive looking at." Elle's hands, pinning silk at Kira's shoulder, went briefly unsteady. "You knew him," Kira said. Not an accusation. Just tired certainty. "I never met him," Elle said, which was true. "My father did." "Did your father like him?" Elle thought of the ledger entry she hadn't dared reread since finding the chest. "Kept the box. Told no one. He asked me not to and I owed him more than an answer. I think," Elle said slowly, "my father thought your grandfather deserved better than what he got." Kira's eyes sharpened, not suspicion exactly, something closer to hope, the kind that had learned to disguise itself as indifference for safety. "My grandfather. Not my father." Elle hadn't meant to say it that precisely. She busied herself with the pins so she wouldn't have to answer the question underneath the question. 5 weeks, Kira said instead, stepping back to check the mirror, letting the moment pass the way people do when they've learned not to chase answers that might cost them more than the not knowing did. "Can you have it ready in 5 weeks?" "I can," Elle said. And in agreeing to the dress, she understood, she had also just agreed to whatever was inside that chest finding its way out before the wedding, whether she chose it or not. He didn't look like a man who threw money at problems. That was, Elle would learn, precisely how he preferred it. "Miss Marsh." Tae-min's Korean was crisp, boardroom smooth. "I'll be direct, since your time is valuable. I'd like to commission you not to make a dress." Elle set down her shears. "I'm sorry?" "Name a figure. Whatever the commission is worth to you, I'll double it, for you to tell Kira Beck you've had a scheduling conflict." "That's not how a scheduling conflict works," Elle said, "and it's not how I run a business." Tae-min's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack in the polish. "You don't understand what you're standing in the middle of. Then explain it to me instead of trying to buy your way past it." For a moment, he looked like he might. Something in his face shifted, tired, not cruel, a man carrying a weight he hadn't chosen and couldn't put down in front of a stranger. Then it closed again. "My mother has weeks, not years," he said instead. "Whatever this shop means to that family, whatever debt you think you're standing in, I am asking you, as a son, not to let it become the last thing she has to survive." He placed a card on the counter, blank except for a number. Think about it. He left before Elle could tell him she wasn't the one holding the debt over his mother's head. His father had made a promise 30 years ago, and it hadn't been to money. Elle looked at the blank card for a long time after the door chimed shut. Then she walked to the back room, knelt in front of the rosewood chest, and this time, she did not stop herself from trying the lid. It was still locked. But for the first time, she wanted it open. The ledger had survived 2 moves and 1 funeral wedged behind a shelf of thread spools, and Elle had avoided it the way you avoid a room where something once happened. She found the entry at 1994, in her father's small, careful hand, the ink slightly too dark where his pen had paused. Fitted the funeral suit today. The tailor before me refused the job, wouldn't say why. Ho-young asked me himself. Paid nothing extra, asked for silence instead. Saw something in the fitting that wasn't my business. Kept the box. Told no one. He asked me not to and I owed him more than an answer. Elle read it 4 times before the date on the opposite page stopped her cold. The funeral had taken place in March. Junho's death certificate, which she'd found years earlier tucked into her father's old files out of nothing but idle curiosity, listed October, 7 months earlier. She sat back against the workbench, the arithmetic rearranging everything she thought she understood. Kira had been born the following August. Which meant, if the dates were right, and her father's ledgers were never wrong, he'd built a career on exactness. Junho had already been dead for nearly a year by the time Kira was conceived. Elle's hand went to her mouth. The family's quiet, decades-old shame, the child Junho refused to acknowledge, had never been possible. He was already gone. Which meant someone had chosen that story on purpose. And her father had known it, had made Junho's funeral suit and seen something in that fitting room he wasn't supposed to see, and had spent the rest of his life keeping a box shut instead of correcting a lie that had shaped a little girl's entire understanding of who she wasn't allowed to be. You'll know it when you hear it, her father had written. Elle finally understood. The right question wasn't who was Kira's father. It was why did no one ever ask? The summons came the next morning, handwritten, delivered by a driver who wouldn't meet Elle's eyes. Come alone. Bring nothing. S. Baek Sunja received her in a sunlit room that smelled of medicine and old cedar, propped upright against pillows with the particular stillness of a woman conserving what little strength remained for something specific. Your father's handwriting, Sunja said, without preamble, holding up the delivery slip from the wedding dress order. I'd know it anywhere. He wrote apologies like he was afraid of taking up too much room. You knew him. I knew what my husband owed him, and what he owed my husband in return. Sunja's eyes, sharp despite everything else about her fading, fixed on Elle's face. You have the box. It wasn't a question, so Elle didn't treat it like one. I do. Destroy it, Sunja said. Unopened. I will pay whatever your father should have charged 30 years ago and never did. Why? Because some truths only look like gifts from the outside. Sunja's voice cracked, just once, before she steadied it. I have spent 27 years letting that girl believe her father was a coward who didn't want her. It is an ugly thing to carry. It is not the ugliest thing I could have given her instead. Elle thought of Kira in the fitting room, tracing the one photograph she owned of a father who'd never had the chance to know she existed. She deserves to know the truth is at least kinder than the lie. Kinder, Sunja repeated, and something in her face went very old and very tired. You have no idea what the truth costs, Miss Marsh. Your father understood. That is precisely why he never opened it either. She closed her eyes, dismissing the conversation the way only the very powerful or the very dying can afford to. Elle left with the box still locked, and a new, colder certainty, whatever Sunja was protecting Kira from wasn't shame at all. It was danger. Kira found the pattern before she found the words for it, 6 years of envelopes, same weight, same unmarked paper, arriving 3 days after rent was due like clockwork, too precise to be charity. She brought one to Ji-yeon's office without an appointment, dropping it on the desk between them. You work for my grandmother. Jian didn't reach for the envelope. That, more than anything, answered the question before she spoke. I do. How long have you been sending these? Longer than you'd believe me if I said the number. Kira's composure, carefully built over a lifetime of not needing anyone from this family, wavered for the first time in the conversation. She knew where I was. This whole time. Every apartment, every job. She knew, and she let me think. Kira stopped, unable to finish the sentence out loud. She has always known, Jian said quietly. Knowing and being able to act on it were never the same thing for her. You'd have to understand what she was managing to understand why. Then help me understand. Please. It came out smaller than Kira intended, the voice of a much younger version of herself, one who had given up asking this question a long time ago because no one had ever answered it. Jian looked at her for a long moment, weighing the loyalty that had cost her more than she'd ever admitted, to a woman who had never once thanked her for it. There are things that are not mine to tell you, she said finally. But I will tell you this much, your grandmother has never believed you were a shame to this family. She has believed, for 27 years, that the truth was more dangerous to you than the lie was. Kira sat very still, the envelope forgotten on the desk between them. Dangerous how? Jian's phone buzzed before she could answer, Taemin's name on the screen, and beneath it, a message that made her go pale, vote's been moved up. Same week as the wedding. We need this contained before then, not after. Elle found him at the tower's rooftop garden, the one place in the building Jian had told her he went when he needed to think without an assistant timing it. You didn't take the money, Taemin said, without turning around. I'm not for sale. Neither is the truth, as it turns out. Elle came to stand beside him at the railing. I know Junho died 7 months before Kira was conceived. My father's ledger has the date. So does the death certificate. Taemin's shoulders dropped, some private battle finally lost. Then you know I've spent 5 weeks fighting you over a lie I didn't tell. Then why fight for it? Because the vote in 5 days decides who controls 70% of this company, and there is a board member who would use any scandal, to force my mother out before she can choose her own successor. It doesn't matter to him whether the scandal is true. It only matters that it's loud. Taemin turned to face her, and for the first time, Elle saw exhaustion instead of arrogance. I have 2 daughters. If this becomes a headline instead of a private conversation, they inherit the fallout of a story that isn't theirs and isn't mine to control once it's public. I'm not protecting a lie, Miss Marsh. I'm trying to keep something private long enough for my mother to tell it on her own terms before she dies, instead of having it ripped out of her by a boardroom fight. Elle was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing, she admitted. But it's also not your decision to make for Kira. She's 27 years past due a truth that isn't yours to keep managing on her behalf. I know, Taemin said, and the admission seemed to cost him something physical. I know. I just don't know how to protect both things at once. Maybe you don't, Elle said. Maybe you just have to choose which one matters more, and live with what it costs. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and something in his face went rigid. The board just moved the vote again, he said quietly. Same day as the wedding. Someone wants this to blow up in public, on purpose, at the worst possible moment. The rehearsal hall was half-lit, chairs stacked along one wall, and Kira stood at the center of it in her half-finished dress, turning in slow circles while Elle pinned the final hem. You keep doing that, Kira said suddenly. Doing what? Counting the exits. Every room you walk into, your eyes go to the doors first. Kira tilted her head. I do the same thing. My mother used to say it was from moving so many times as a kid. I never told her I still do it now that I don't have to. Elle's hand stilled at the hem. My father did it too. He never told me why. Something passed between them, recognition, unearned and unexplained, the kind that happens between 2 people who've inherited the same wariness from parents who never named its source. Tell me, Kira said quietly. Whatever it is you've been carrying since the day I walked into your shop. I'd rather know than keep being the only person in every room who doesn't. So Elle told her, the ledger, the funeral suit, the impossible timeline, the box with its unfamiliar seal, Sunja's plea to destroy it unopened, Taemin's fear of a boardroom weaponizing whatever truth it held. Kira didn't cry. She went very still instead, the particular stillness of someone recalculating an entire life against new information. He was already dead, she said slowly. My whole life, I thought he didn't want me. He was already gone before I existed. I think that's only half the truth, Elle said gently. I think there's a reason no one has ever told you the other half. The door at the back of the hall opened before Kira could respond. Sunja stood in the doorway, out of her hospital bed and dressed as if she intended to be taken seriously, and 4 lines still taped beneath her sleeve, Ji-yeon a half-step behind her looking as though she'd tried and failed to stop this. I should have told you myself, a long time ago, Sunja said, her voice steady despite everything her body was clearly costing her to stand upright. I am not leaving this room until I finally do. Sunja lowered herself into a chair with Ji-yeon's steadying hand, and for a long moment simply looked at Kira the way a person looks at something they've loved from a distance for too long to know how to love up close. Your father was already gone when you were conceived. You know that now, Sunja began. What you don't know is who your biological father is. He was a friend of Junho's, a man named Yoon Se-hyun. Charming, in the way that always precedes danger. He courted your mother in her grief, the year after Junho died, and by the time she understood what he was, she was already carrying you and already frightened of him. Kira's breathing had gone shallow. Frightened how? He did not let women leave quietly, Sunja said, each word deliberate, careful of a wound she clearly knew the shape of. Your mother fled to London with nothing but you and a story she asked me to protect, that Junho was your father, and had simply refused to acknowledge you. A small, survivable shame. Better than the truth, which was a man who would have spent the rest of your childhood finding ways back into your life. You let me hate a dead man instead, Kira whispered, to protect me from a living one. Yes, Sunja said simply, no defense in it, only exhaustion. And I would tell you it was the right choice, except I have never been certain, not for one day in 27 years, that keeping you safely at a distance and keeping you loved were the same thing. I chose the version where you were safe. I am not sure I chose the version where you were happy. Across the room, Taemin stood in the doorway, having arrived in time to hear it. The board member pushing for the vote this week, he said slowly, the color draining from his face, is Yoon Se-hyun's son. He's been trying to force a scandal into the open for months. He doesn't know why it would matter to him. He just knows it would hurt us. The room went silent with the particular weight of a truth finally large enough to explain everything at once, Sunja's silence, Taemin's fear, Ji-yeon's envelopes, the seal on a box that had never belonged to the Beck family at all, but to the man who'd once helped keep a dangerous name away from a little girl who never knew she needed protecting. Sunja's hand went to her chest. Her breath caught, then didn't quite return. Ji-yeon was already moving, already calling for help, and Kira dropped to her knees beside the only grandmother she'd ever known, holding a woman she'd hated an hour ago as if letting go now would undo the truth just spoken. Don't, Kira said. Don't you dare leave before I get to tell you I understand. Sunja survived the night, though the doctors were careful never to promise more than that. She survived the shareholder vote too, in the end, not because the truth stayed hidden, but because Taemin chose, at the last possible hour, to bring the real story to the board privately rather than let Yoon Se-hyun's son detonate a version of it designed to do maximum damage. The truth, delivered on their own terms, turned out to have less power to destroy them than the lie had given their enemies to threaten them with. Yoon Se-hyun's son resigned from the board 11 days later. No headline ever named why. Some truths, it turned out, could still be kept private, just not secret, which Elle was beginning to understand were not the same thing at all. The box, finally opened, held exactly what David Marsh's ledger had promised: photographs, a signed private statement from Junho's own doctor confirming the timeline, and a short letter from Ho-young to no one in particular, dated the week of the funeral. If anyone ever asks the right question, give them this. Do not open it for money, and do not open it out of fear. Only open it for her. Elle read it 3 times before she finally understood what her father had actually promised, all those years ago. Not silence forever. Just silence until it was needed less than the truth was. On the morning of the wedding, Elle made the final adjustments to Kira's dress in a quiet room at the back of the venue, the two of them alone the way the first fitting had been. You could have told me sooner, Kira said, not unkindly, watching herself in the mirror. I could have, Elle agreed. I think I was protecting the promise more than I was protecting you. It took me a while to understand those weren't the same thing either. Kira turned from the mirror and, for the first time since she'd walked into the shop 5 weeks earlier, let herself smile without guarding it. My mother's coming today. So is my grandmother, against every doctor's advice, apparently, because Jian couldn't stop her. She paused. She wants to sit in the front row. Do you want her there? I don't know if I forgive her yet, Kira said honestly. But I know the version of her who lied to protect me from a monster is easier to sit with than the version I invented, who just didn't want me at all. That has to count for something. Elle finished the last stitch and stepped back to let Kira see the whole of it in the mirror. 30 years of a promise, finally, quietly, kept the way it was always meant to be, not as a secret, but as a debt finally paid in full, in the open, to the person who'd been owed it the entire time. It's ready, Elle said. Kira nodded, and for a moment neither of them moved, 2 women who had inherited the habit of watching the door, standing together in a room where, for once, nothing was coming for either of them. If this story hit different from the usual ones, that's the point. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments, was Taemin wrong to try to protect his mother, or was he just protecting her the only way he knew how?